September had only just begun, and the trees by the lake were already showing the first hints of golden and crimson leaves. Larry and I arrived at our house in Vermont, a house standing in seclusion, far from town, as if hidden among the trees and reflections on the water. Once inside, I felt the familiar warmth and comfort immediately fill the air around me. This house was special to us. It was here that we spent our first years together, a time when every day seemed to brim with tenderness and anticipation. Larry immediately set about tending to the fireplace, while I ran my hand over the smooth surface of the wooden table, sighing with a gentle nostalgia. How many memories this house held, each window, each corner. Here, we would dream about the future, making plans to travel the world, dreaming of something big and bright. But as the years passed, the everyday routine increasingly took up our time, blurring the moments that once seemed unbreakable. Larry approached me, perhaps catching the pensive look in my eyes. He gently wrapped his arms around me, and I felt something come alive in my soul. His touch felt just as it had before, steady, strong yet tender. Together, we went to the kitchen and began preparing dinner, quietly chatting as we used to, when every word we shared felt significant and meaningful. Laughter filled the house, as though we had never left, as though our hearts were opening up to each other again, forgetting how often we had been consumed by work and the bustle of city life. When dinner was ready, Larry placed the plates on the table, and we sat across from each other. The scent of roasted salmon and fresh bread filled the room, mingling with the warm, woody notes of the fireplace. Smiling at Larry, I remembered how I first realized in this very house that I was truly happy with him. The soft glow of the lamps highlighted every contour of his face, every trace of the years and cares he had carried. There was a tender sparkle in his eyes, and I knew he felt the same. The next day was just as clear and fresh as a morning in the forest after rain. Mist stretched across the lake, cloaking the water in a soft veil, and the air was filled with the scent of pine and damp leaves. Larry stood by the window, captivated by the scene, and I quietly approached him with a cup of hot coffee. He turned, lightly touched my shoulder, and smiled just as he had in the early days of our time together. "Want to take a walk?" he suggested, taking my hand. We stepped onto the path that wound along the lake and strolled leisurely, surrounded by autumn colors. Our feet sank into the soft leaves, and the trees rustled around us as if speaking to us in their mysterious language. Everything felt so simple and perfect. The gentle breeze enveloping us, the crunch of branches underfoot, and me, next to the person I had always considered closest to my heart. We walked in silence until we reached a spot where the shoreline formed a cozy little cove. Larry unexpectedly took my hand, looking at me wordlessly, and I realized how much these simple moments meant to me. His gaze spoke louder than words. We both missed this. The quiet, inexpressible language that existed only between us, in gentle touches, subtle glances, and warm smiles. A little later, after returning to the house, we decided to take the boat out onto the lake. Larry took the oars with confidence, while I sat across from him, watching as he effortlessly guided the boat, swaying slightly in rhythm with his movements. When we reached the middle of the lake, he stopped rowing and looked at me, his eyes shining with a playful light. "What do you say? Shall we try fishing one more time, like in the good old days?" he asked with a grin. I laughed, remembering how early in our marriage we had once decided to go fishing here, only for it to end in complete failure, with nets cast too far and no fish caught. But back then, none of it mattered, because we were simply enjoying every moment together, just as we were today. Our days passed by in a steady, tranquil rhythm, filled with walks and unhurried conversations. One evening, while Larry stepped away briefly, the phone rang. He answered it, and from the tone of his voice, I immediately sensed that the call carried unexpected news. Returning to the table, he said, "Margaret, we're going to have a guest. Derek is planning to visit for a couple of days. He's in the area on business and thought it might be nice to drop by." I tried to keep a neutral expression, but something inside me tensed. Derek was Larry's son from his first marriage, and though we weren't particularly close, he'd always been more of a friend than just a stepson to me. It's only for a few days, Larry added, noticing my silence. I nodded with a smile, though I couldn't shake a slight feeling of disappointment. I had hoped that this time away would be just for the two of us, a place where we could reconnect, away from everyone else. But I knew how much it meant to Larry to spend time with Derek, so I decided to see it as an opportunity to get closer to him, to turn his visit into a positive moment for all of us. When Derek arrived, he was, as always, casual and friendly. Tall, athletic, with a slight smirk, he brought with him a sense of urban confidence that slightly contrasted with the quiet solitude of our lake house. His energy filled the space instantly, and although I tried not to show it, part of me felt as though our cozy time alone had dissipated. Larry and I invited him to sit on the terrace, and the evening unfolded in lighthearted conversation and jokes. Derek, as always, had a knack for keeping the conversation flowing, ensuring that we never fell silent. He had a way of punctuating our words, making it seem as if everything was moving naturally. But when he looked at me, his gaze lingered just a bit longer than necessary, and I started to feel a faint unease. That night, left alone with Larry, I turned to him and said that perhaps Derek's visit might actually be a good thing for us. It's a chance for all of us to grow closer, I whispered, trying to convince myself as much as him. Larry seemed to believe it too. But something inside me couldn't shake the feeling that this visit would change not only our time together, but the very atmosphere of the house. I just didn't know yet how much. The morning was misty, and the silence over the lake seemed especially thick. As always, Larry went about his errands after breakfast, promising to be back by lunchtime. That day, we had planned a long walk to the old farm, which had once been the heart of the village and still bore traces of its former glory, though it had grown quite dilapidated. The three of us walked along a winding forest path surrounded by the vibrant colors of the autumn woods. Derek walked beside his father, exchanging brief phrases, while I lagged behind slightly, feeling the forest quietly envelop us, as if shielding us from the rest of the world. Soon, however, Larry received a call, and with an apology, he was delayed, leaving Derek and me alone. I wasn't sure how to react to this situation. The last time we had been alone was when he was still a teenager, and we had never shared especially close moments. Then, unexpectedly, Derek began to talk, sharing stories about his life in Chicago, the people he worked with, and his interests. I listened, surprised at how much he had changed. He was no longer a teenager. Now he was a confident, charismatic young man with a sharp mind and an easy way of speaking that drew me into every word. At one point, he paid me a compliment, completely casual, but his gaze lingered on me a little longer than I'd expected. It was a fleeting, almost imperceptible feeling, but I found myself blushing slightly, as if I were suddenly 20 years old again. Derek joked, occasionally touching my hand, and I felt a faint thrill. "You always look so lovely, Margaret. I think nature really does bring out your beauty," he said, and I felt myself flush. I smiled but couldn't think of a response. His look was gentle, but there was something in it that I couldn't quite explain. I knew there should be nothing between us but friendly affection, yet the sensation of his attention, and my subtle unease, wouldn't leave me. When Larry rejoined us, I felt a mixture of relief and awkwardness. I knew I shouldn't make too much of it, and yet that small, almost imperceptible feeling of Derek's attention left me unsettled. Deep down, I understood I should push this feeling aside, but somehow it lingered, like a thorn lodged in my finger, sharp and strange. For the rest of the day, I kept catching myself thinking about Derek, recalling his gaze and the way he joked, trying to brighten our walk. The next day, Larry left for town to pick up groceries, leaving Derek and me alone. The morning was quiet and sunny, and when he suggested we have a picnic, I agreed, hoping that the fresh air would clear my odd thoughts and let us bond on a more friendly level. We packed a basket with food and headed to a small clearing near the lake, where the trees formed a natural shelter, and the autumn light filtered through the branches, creating a cozy, almost magical atmosphere. Sitting on a blanket, sorting through the snacks we'd prepared, we talked and laughed. Derek easily shared funny stories from his work in Chicago, tales about his colleagues and the quirky situations that sometimes occurred. I listened, laughing, feeling the tension between us melt away, replaced by simple, relaxed conversation. He spoke so casually and confidently that I seemed to see again the boy I once knew. And at the same time, I felt how much he'd grown, radiating a unique, almost magnetic charisma. At one point, mid-conversation, I reached up to adjust a lock of hair that had fallen over my face, and Derek reached out to tuck it back, his hand gently brushing my cheek. His hand lingered longer than I expected, and his gaze turned a bit more serious, deeper. Our eyes met, and I realized the moment was stretching too long. He smiled, slowly withdrawing his hand, but something in his look reminded me of those rare moments that make the heart beat faster, moments usually reserved for stories. I quickly averted my eyes, trying to return to our conversation as if nothing had happened, but I could feel the warmth in my cheeks. I sensed his gaze on me, and I understood that something was shifting between us, something I couldn't and didn't want to acknowledge. We continued with the picnic, and I tried to laugh, distracting myself from what had just happened, convincing myself it was just an innocent moment, that the touch meant nothing. When we returned to the house, I avoided his gaze, feeling that something inside me was stirring, a feeling I needed to resist. We returned from the picnic to the house, where the silence felt especially heavy. I sensed that something had shifted. Larry was still out, and the house was unusually quiet. Derek walked beside me, and I could feel his presence so acutely, as if there was an invisible but charged line between us that I was afraid to cross. As we neared the door, Derek suddenly stopped. I felt him hold his breath and turn to ask what was wrong. But before I could say anything, he took my hand, firmly but gently, and I found myself unable to pull away, even though part of me screamed to. He looked at me, his gaze intense and serious, and I felt rooted in place, unable to look away. Everything happening felt surreal. "Margaret," he began, and his voice carried so much regret, longing, something deep and nearly repressed. Without waiting for a response, he leaned in and kissed me. At first, I froze, caught in a wave of shock and confusion. I tried to pull back, but something within me fractured, giving in to a feeling that had long slumbered deep inside, buried and forgotten. I responded to the kiss, and in that moment, the world around us disappeared. It had been so long since I'd felt like this kiss, this fleeting spark. It was wrong, and I knew I had to stop, but the intensity of the moment swept over me completely. Questions spun in my mind. Why now? Why him? When it ended, I stepped back, feeling a wave of confusion and guilt wash over me. Derek stood before me, silent, his eyes full of regret, yet also a determination that left me no doubt that something significant had passed between us. We both understood that this moment had changed everything, that things could no longer be the same. "I shouldn't have," I whispered, barely holding myself together. But Derek only held my hands, his gaze filled with tenderness and understanding. In that instant, I knew that despite everything, despite what this kiss meant for both of us, I couldn't simply erase it from my life. Now, I was bound to him by a secret I wasn't sure how to keep. In the days that followed, my relationship with Derek transformed. We found ways to be alone, and these moments, filled with quiet intensity, felt surreal. We could no longer just be friends or even just family. I tried everything to keep my composure around Larry, but each encounter with Derek left a mark that I struggled to hide. We invented reasons to go on walks together, found any excuse to leave the house to share a few stolen moments that revived feelings I hadn't experienced in so long. It felt like a game, and each day I sank deeper into it, fearful but powerless to stop. One evening when Larry was out, Derek and I stepped out onto the terrace under the pretense of watching the sunset. We stood side by side, gazing into the distance without saying a word. Then, unable to resist, Derek wrapped his arms around me. For a moment, the world around us disappeared, leaving only us. His kiss was gentle, and in it, I felt everything he was trying to conceal. With each encounter, he became more attentive and tender, as if trying to fill a void I hadn't realized had grown in my marriage. He understood me without words, seemed to know what I was missing, and gave me that without asking for anything in return. At first, I told myself that this was temporary, just an infatuation, that these feelings would fade like autumn rain. This affair, our secret, wove around me like a net from which I didn't know how to escape. Each meeting only deepened my feelings, and though I knew I was playing with fire, I couldn't stop. With Larry, I tried to be the same, loving and attentive, but there was an invisible wall between us that I could feel more strongly each day, a barrier I could no longer ignore. One night, while Larry slept soundly, I heard the faint chime of a phone. It was a message from Derek. Holding my breath in the darkness of the bedroom, I read his brief, thrilling invitation. Meet me at the lake. I got up, careful not to wake Larry, threw on a jacket, and slipped quietly out of the house. Outside, everything was still. The stars reflected off the lake's surface, and the air was cool and crisp, sending a shiver through me. Derek waited at the water's edge, his dark silhouette merging with the shadows of the trees. We stood by the lake in silence, and in that quiet, I felt more than I could ever express in words. We sat by the shore, holding each other, and the night's stillness wrapped around us, shielding us from reality and making the rest of the world fade into insignificance. In these moments, I felt fully alive. As dawn began to break through the trees, I knew it was time to return before Larry noticed I was gone. Walking back to the house, I felt the weight of living a double life, balancing between reality and this fiery, all-consuming pull I could not control. Returning home at dawn, a wave of doubt and guilt washed over me, weighing heavily on my shoulders. Memories of the night with Derek still burned in my mind. These feelings lingered all day, and as I stood beside Larry, I made a decision. I had to try to put everything back in place, to strengthen what was still there between us, to remember what had once connected us. Maybe it was too late, but I hoped I could still save our marriage. When Larry left for town on errands, I decided on a small, meaningful surprise. I took candles from the kitchen and placed them on the table, preparing his favorite meal, doing everything as I had in our early years together. I wrote a short note and placed it on his bed so he'd see it right away. Tonight, just you and me. I'll be waiting by the fireplace. When everything was ready, I looked around the house. The candles were already lit, their soft glow casting a warm, romantic light over the room. I stood still, feeling torn between two worlds, one pulling me toward Derek, the other reminding me of the years with Larry, the genuine, bright moments we'd shared. Then the door opened, and for a moment, I thought it was Larry. But when I looked, I saw Derek standing there instead. His eyes scanned the table, the candles, then met mine. Tension filled the space between us, and I couldn't hide my unease. He stepped closer, looking at me intently, a sad, faint smile on his face. "Do you really want this, Margaret?" he asked softly. I stayed silent, unable to answer. His words felt like a challenge, a reminder of the feelings I was now trying to bury, to lock away. Derek took another step closer, but then he stopped, as if understanding that my choice was mine alone. "I'm going into town," he said, breaking the silence. "Spend this evening with Larry." In his eyes, I saw both pain and understanding. He let go of my hand and, without waiting for a response, turned and left, leaving me in turmoil. When Larry arrived, I tried to look cheerful and confident, as though nothing had happened. We sat at the table, and I saw him relax, comforted by the care surrounding him that evening. I tried to rekindle those old feelings, to remember all the reasons I had once loved him so deeply, but inside, I still felt torn and empty. We laughed, we talked, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Derek, to the truth he had seen, that he was right to leave us alone. That evening was a step toward preserving my marriage, but even my most sincere efforts couldn't silence the realization that the rift between Larry and me had grown too deep, that something vital had slipped away from our relationship and bringing it back might be impossible. Night settled over the house with only the soft glow of dying candles and the crackle of wood in the fireplace remaining. Larry, content and peaceful, had gone upstairs to prepare for bed, while I stayed by the fire, lost in thought. Relief washed over me that the evening had passed calmly. Yet, no matter how much I tried to deny it, a hollow feeling and a dull anxiety gnawed at me from within. Sitting by the fireplace, I heard a faint creak of the door. Turning, I saw a dark figure. For a moment, my breath caught. I thought it was Larry, coming back to give me one more embrace before bed. I stood up, smiling, ready to share another warm moment with him. But as the figure stepped closer, I realized it was Derek. He stood in the doorway, his expression complex, almost mirroring my own tangled feelings. Before I could say anything, he crossed the room and pulled me close, giving me no time to think. He kissed me. My resolve crumbled instantly, and I couldn't resist. My emotions swept away completely. I let myself go, allowing this feeling to consume me, forgetting everything I stood to lose. The world shrank to that single moment, a moment that felt like an escape from the monotony that had slowly wrapped around me for years. My feelings for Larry, the memories of our marriage, seemed to recede into a hazy background, leaving only Derek and me in a way I could no longer ignore. But then, at the worst possible moment, the door upstairs creaked, and Larry's footsteps sounded on the stairs. We broke apart, but it was too late. Larry stood in the doorway, his face pale, his gaze filled with shock, anger, and pain. I watched as, in that instant, everything we'd built, everything that had once bound us together, shattered in his eyes. He stood motionless, and the air in the room turned heavy, pressing down on all three of us. "How could you, Margaret?" He finally choked out, his voice trembling with restrained emotion. I tried to say something, to explain, but the words stuck, turning into quiet, broken sobs. Derek looked at his father, understanding the horror of what had happened, and made no attempt to justify himself. Larry turned away, ignoring my desperate attempts to explain, and walked out of the house, the door slamming behind him. In that moment, I realized I had just destroyed my life, my family, everything I had built and cherished. I was left standing in an empty house, alone with Derek, feeling nothing but a crushing loneliness and the cold weight of betrayal pressing down on my heart, leaving no hope for forgiveness. This moment was the end. The fatal point where I lost not only Larry, but a piece of myself. After the door slammed behind Larry, I stood in deafening silence, listening to the echo of a world that had once made me happy slipping away. The house, which only moments before had felt like a refuge, now closed in on me, its walls steeped in pain and betrayal. Derek was still nearby, but I couldn't look at him. His presence only intensified the guilt and helplessness that I couldn't name. Unable to stay in the room any longer, I moved toward the window, staring into the darkness outside, overwhelmed by the crushing realization that I had just shattered my family. Derek took a step forward, his hand reaching toward me, but I pulled back sharply. "You need to leave," I whispered, my voice hollow, as though it belonged to someone else. He was silent. I could feel his gaze but didn't dare turn to face him. There was genuine pain in his eyes, but at that moment, I couldn't comfort him, no matter how much I wished I could undo everything that had happened. Eventually, he nodded quietly, without a word, and left, leaving me alone with a pain that only grew sharper. Left alone, I tried to gather my thoughts, but they scattered like shards. Images of Larry haunted me, his eyes filled with hurt, his hands that had once held me so tenderly. Our life together, once filled with joy and tenderness, now seemed like a fragile illusion I had shattered in a single moment. I felt despair and guilt tearing me apart from the inside. Several hours passed before I found the strength to leave the house and search for Larry. I walked along the darkened paths toward the lake, hoping I could explain, find words to bring him back, to calm him. But when I reached the water's edge, he wasn't there. I looked around, called his name, but only the silence of the night and the dull splash of water answered me. I didn't know where he had gone, and panic gripped me anew. That night, I returned to an empty house, realizing that I might have lost Larry forever. The world I had tried so hard to hold together had crumbled, leaving only ruins. All I could do was wait, hoping he would come back to listen, maybe even forgive. But a deep, gnawing feeling told me that such forgiveness might be impossible. Days passed and Larry did not return. I replayed every moment, every choice, every step that had led to this disaster. I understood that in allowing myself to yield to a fleeting passion, I had lost something far more valuable, and no matter how much I tried, I couldn't reclaim it. I had destroyed not only my relationship, but Larry's faith in me, in our family. In the end, I realized that all that was left for me was to accept the consequences and live with this burden, knowing that I had lost everything that truly mattered. Weeks passed, then months. I stayed in our lakeside home, unable to leave the place where I'd once been so happy, as though the last grains of warmth and hope could still be gathered from these walls, from the view of the calm, dark lake. Larry gave no sign of himself. Friends would pass along brief messages saying only that he was okay, but nothing more, and each new day filled with this silence, painfully sharp and endless. I didn't want to go anywhere. It felt as though by staying here, I could somehow preserve our story, keep it anchored on the shores of the lake where we had once built our dreams. Somewhere inside, a faint hope lingered that Larry might return, that perhaps he'd want to hear an explanation, some kind of truth, if it could even change anything. One day, as the first snow arrived on a gust of wind, I walked out to the lake's edge, where the water had frozen over and was scattered with tiny crystals of ice. I stared at the frost, searching in its glimmer for answers, trying to understand how I had lost everything that once mattered. Tears no longer came. Instead, there was an emptiness far more frightening and agonizing. This emptiness stretched from deep within me like a cold, bottomless depth. And then I heard footsteps. I turned and saw Larry standing behind me. He looked different, older, a little more weary, but his gaze was steady and resolute. I couldn't say a word. It was as if time had frozen between us. I just looked at him, not daring to hope for forgiveness or anything that could soften what I had done. "I didn't know if I would ever come back here," he said, his voice low, even calm. "I thought I could just forget, let go, but something held me back. Maybe it was our years together, maybe all those memories that I couldn't simply erase." I held my breath, not knowing how to respond. His words felt like a revelation, a gift I hadn't dared to expect. Larry stepped forward, his eyes filled with pain, yet also with an understanding I knew I hadn't earned. "I realize something, Margaret," he said. "Our past can't be undone. We can't go back and rewrite it. But I also realize that I can't live without trying to forgive you, without giving myself the chance to find my own peace." The silence between us was as deep as the winter lake, but it no longer tore us apart. Instead, it filled with something soothing, a kind of quiet, gentle reconciliation. I understood that his forgiveness might not bring me happiness, but it would allow us both to keep living, carrying this story, this experience, with us. We stood side by side for a long time, looking out over the frozen lake. And though the future remained uncertain, I knew that in his forgiveness, Larry had given me the chance to rediscover myself. And with that, the faint glimmer of hope. Since the day Larry found the strength to forgive me, life began to slowly fill with a sense of purpose I thought I'd lost forever. We started with small steps, talking like old friends, discussing simple things, finding comfort in memories that no longer felt tainted by guilt. Larry was reserved but attentive, and his quiet presence helped me gradually climb out of the abyss I had fallen into through my own mistakes. Winter gave way to spring, and our lakeside home came alive with the first rays of sunshine, as if nature itself, in its rebirth, was offering us a chance for a fresh start. We never spoke about the past. An unspoken agreement settled between us. Not to dwell on what had happened, but to move forward, as two people who were once close but were now learning to know each other all over again. One evening, as we sat by the fireplace, Larry spoke, his voice calm but firm. "I thought our marriage was unbreakable, that no mistakes could tear it apart. But I realize now that isn't true. Our relationship will always be different. Changed, tested. But Margaret, I want us to try again. I want to give this a chance, even if it won't be easy. Tears welled up, but I stayed silent, afraid to break the spell of his words, even with a sigh. I could hardly believe he was willing to try. My gratitude was so profound that I struggled to respond, but he squeezed my hand, reassuring me as if to say that everything would be all right, that he was willing to walk this path with me, no matter how rough it might be. From that point on, we began to rebuild our marriage brick by brick. We didn't rush, but with each day spent together, we found new meaning, a new understanding of each other. There were tears and difficult conversations, but with each challenge we overcame, our trust grew, slowly but steadily. Sometimes I would catch myself thinking that the past doesn't vanish without a trace, that it leaves scars. But these scars, strangely enough, became part of our story, a part of us. I no longer tried to escape the pain or regrets, but learned to live with them, accepting them as a significant lesson. Over time, Larry and I rediscovered the peace we had lost. Our marriage had changed. It had become deeper, more complex, richer. We knew each other in a new way, and there was a bittersweet, genuine joy in that. In being together despite everything that had happened. Our new beginning was far from perfect, but it was real.